In the roaring 1922nd, America celebrated prosperity, innovation, and the promise of a brighter future. But hidden beneath that optimism was a deal so corrupt it would stain an entire presidency. A secret arrangement over oil-rich lands meant for the U.S. Navy turned into a personal gold mine for powerful men in Washington. Suitcases of cash, backroom meetings, and contracts signed in absolute secrecy, all pointing toward the inner circle of President Warren G. Harding. This is the true story of the Teapot Dome scandal. How oil money, political favors, and unchecked power brought a government to its knees. The year was 1921. World War I had ended, and America was enjoying a booming economy. President Warren G. Harding had swept into office promising a return to normalcy, stability after years of conflict and political upheaval. Far from the political spotlight, in the windswept plains of Wyoming, lay Teapot Dome, a remote oil reserve held by the U.S. Navy. Its purpose was clear: to serve as a fuel supply for the fleet in times of national emergency. Similar reserves sat in California, forming part of the nation's strategic defense. But that same year, Harding made a fateful decision. He transferred control of these naval oil reserves from the Navy Department to the Department of the Interior, led by Albert B. Fall, a former senator and close friend. Fall, a man known for his rugged charm and taste for luxury, suddenly found himself with authority over some of the most valuable energy assets in the country. What happened next would be anything but normal. Instead of protecting the reserves, Fall quietly opened the door to private oil companies, setting the stage for one of the biggest bribery scandals in U.S. history. This video will take you inside the Teapot Dome scandal, a true story of political greed, secret deals, and oil money that shook the Harding administration to its core. You'll see how Interior Secretary Albert Fall bypassed competitive bidding, handed over America's strategic oil reserves to wealthy friends, and pocketed a fortune in bribes. We'll trace the trail from quiet contracts to explosive Senate hearings, and reveal how the scandal destroyed reputations, sent a cabinet official to prison, and left a permanent stain on Harding's legacy. By the end, you'll understand why Teapot Dome remains America's most infamous political oil deal. Albert Bacon Fall wasn't a newcomer to politics. Born in a Kentucky log cabin in 1861, he had built his career as a lawyer, rancher, and eventually a U.S. Senator from New Mexico. Known for his frontier toughness and persuasive charm, Fall was no stranger to making deals both in the open and behind closed doors. When Warren G. Harding became president in 1921, he brought Fall into his Ohio gang, a circle of trusted allies. Harding appointed him Secretary of the Interior, a position traditionally focused on managing public lands, not military fuel reserves. But Harding soon signed an executive order transferring control of the naval oil reserves from the Navy to the Interior Department. The official reasoning was that Fall's department could manage the lands more efficiently. In reality, it gave Fall direct control over vast underground oceans of petroleum, the kind of resource that could make or break fortunes. To the public, it seemed like a routine bureaucratic shift. Inside Washington, it was seen as an opportunity, and Fall wasted no time in seizing it. Because in politics, control is power. And in the oil business, power means money. In early 1922, Albert Fall began holding quiet meetings with two powerful oil magnates, Harry F. Sinclair of Mammoth Oil and Edward L. Doheny of Pan American Petroleum. Both men had the wealth, influence, and ambition to turn government oil reserves into private profit. Instead of following the law and opening the leases to competitive bidding, Fall bypassed the process entirely. Behind closed doors, he negotiated exclusive drilling rights for Sinclair at Teapot Dome in Wyoming and for Doheny at reserves in California. No public announcements, no congressional oversight. The agreements were dressed up as emergency arrangements to develop the oil in case the Navy needed it quickly. In truth, the leases were sweetheart deals worth millions in future profits for Sinclair and Doheny. On paper, it all looked legitimate, a few signatures on official Interior Department contracts. But beneath the ink was an unspoken understanding. These deals would be profitable for everyone involved, including Fall himself. Fall's sudden improvements in lifestyle soon drew quiet whispers in Washington. Expensive gifts, elaborate parties, and a brand new ranch property didn't fit a cabinet secretary's salary. And yet, no one dared confront him, at least, not yet. Every secret deal leaves a paper trail, and this one was about to surface. The money didn't come as a simple paycheck. It came in shadows and sometimes in leather. In November 1921, Edward Doheny personally sent his son, Ned Doheny, to deliver $100,000 in cash to Albert Falls, Washington apartment. The bills were neatly stacked in a black satchel, the kind a businessman might carry to a meeting. Officially, it was called a loan, but no repayment schedule was ever recorded. Around the same time, Harry Sinclair showered Fall with gifts: cattle for his New Mexico ranch, the construction of new livestock pens, and a series of investments in his personal businesses. Combined, these gestures were worth tens of thousands of fortune in 1922nd America. Fall used the money to pay off debts, expand his ranch, and live far beyond his cabinet salary. He insisted these were private transactions between friends, unconnected to the oil leases. But as more details emerged, the line between friendship and bribery blurred until it vanished completely. For now, the deal stayed buried. The public knew nothing, and the oil rigs at Teapot Dome began pumping. But political secrets rarely stay underground forever, especially when money and power are involved. And in 1922, a crack in the silence began to form. The first break came not from Washington insiders, but from persistent journalists out west. Reporters from the Rocky Mountain News and Casper Tribune noticed unusual activity at Teapot Dome, fenced-off federal land buzzing with drilling equipment, guarded by private security. Questions began to swirl. Why was a private oil company operating on land reserved for the U.S. Navy? And why had there been no public bidding? Senator John B. Kendrick of Wyoming caught wind of the rumors. In April 1922, he stood on the Senate floor and called for an investigation. His comments were cautious but pointed enough to put the Interior Department on notice. National newspapers smelled blood. The New York Times and Chicago Tribune sent their top political reporters to dig deeper. They pored over land records, traced corporate filings, and began piecing together the link between Sinclair's Mammoth Oil and Albert Falls' sudden wealth. Within weeks, headlines screamed of secret oil leases and deals behind closed doors. The Harding administration publicly dismissed the stories as political attacks. Privately, the White House worried that the whispers were turning into a roar. And once the press locked on, the Senate was ready to pounce. By late 1922, the Senate Public Lands Committee, led by Senator Thomas J. Walsh of Montana, launched a formal investigation. Walsh was meticulous, a methodical lawyer with a reputation for patience. He knew scandals unraveled slowly, and he was willing to wait. At first, the Interior Department stonewalled. Contracts were misplaced. Witnesses had poor memories, and meetings were conveniently undocumented. But Walsh kept pressing. He subpoenaed financial records, summoned oil executives, and compared timelines. Over months of hearings, the picture came into focus. The leases to Sinclair and Doheny had bypassed the legal bidding process entirely. Even more damning, Walsh traced a series of large cash transfers and property upgrades directly to Albert Falls accounts. The most explosive moment came when Edward Doheny admitted under oath that he had sent his son with $100,000 in cash to Fall. Fall, now visibly worn and defiant, insisted it was a personal loan, unrelated to the leases. The senators weren't convinced. As testimony piled up, public opinion turned sharply against the Harding administration. Editorials demanded accountability. The phrase Teapot Dome became shorthand for political corruption, and the investigation was about to move from the Senate floor to the courtroom. The Teapot Dome investigation moved from headlines to the halls of justice in 1926. Albert Fall, no longer Secretary of the Interior, now stood as a defendant in one of the most closely watched corruption trials in U.S. history. Federal prosecutors accused Fall of accepting bribes in exchange for granting the oil leases to Sinclair and Doheny. The evidence was damning. The $100,000 cash loan, improvements to his ranch, and testimony from multiple witnesses who confirmed the arrangements were anything but innocent. Fall maintained his defense that he was simply borrowing money from friends, that no quid pro quo existed, but the jury didn't buy it. In 1929, he was convicted of bribery, becoming the first former U.S. cabinet official to serve prison time for crimes committed in office. He served 1 year in prison, his reputation in ruins, his finances destroyed. Sinclair was convicted of contempt of court and jury tampering, serving 6 months in jail. Doheny, in a twist that puzzled the public, was acquitted of bribery charges despite admitting to delivering the cash. The trials cemented Teapot Dome's place in history as a synonym for government corruption. But for President Harding's legacy, the verdict came far too late. By the time the full scope of the Teapot Dome scandal became public, President Warren G. Harding was no longer alive to face the political storm. He had died suddenly in August 1923 during a cross-country tour, reportedly of a heart attack. His death spared him the humiliation of watching his administration unravel in courtrooms and newspaper columns. Still, Harding's legacy was permanently stained. Though there was no direct evidence he profited from the leases, the fact that he appointed Albert Fall and transferred control of the reserves made him politically responsible. Critics painted him as either complicit or dangerously unaware of corruption in his inner circle. Public trust in government took a sharp hit. Teapot Dome became a rallying cry for reformers pushing for stricter oversight of federal resources. It also emboldened investigative journalists and reinforced the role of Congress as a check on executive power. In the years that followed, Teapot Dome entered the American political vocabulary as a shorthand for any scandal involving high-level corruption. Even decades later, the phrase would resurface whenever a president or cabinet official faced accusations of misconduct. The oil stopped flowing long ago, but the political fallout still lingers. Many people still believe President Warren G. Harding personally pocketed money from the Teapot Dome scandal, but historical records tell a different story. No credible evidence ever proved he took bribes. What did happen, however, was his decision to shift control of the Navy's oil reserves to his friend, Interior Secretary Albert Fall, a move that handed Fall both the opportunity and the authority to make the corrupt deals. Harding's sudden death in 1923 left questions unanswered, and his silence before then only fueled suspicion. Another common misconception is that Teapot Dome was just about Wyoming. In truth, the leases extended to California's Elk Hills and Buena Vista Hills reserves, granted under equally questionable circumstances to Edward Doheny's Pan American Petroleum. The name Teapot Dome stuck because the Wyoming Reserve became the scandal's public face, but the scheme's reach was far broader. Fall's eventual prison sentence marked the first time a former cabinet member went to jail for crimes committed in office. It was a milestone for accountability, but it didn't end corruption in federal resource management. Instead, Teapot Dome became a lasting warning, a reminder that unchecked power, secrecy, and personal favors can erode public trust faster than any economic crisis. A century later, the oil has long stopped flowing, but the lessons remain. Power must be balanced, transparency must be protected, and history will always remember when a government forgets to serve its people. If there is one lesson Teapot Dome should leave us, it is that silence and secrecy are the greatest allies of corruption. Harding's presidency promised a return to normalcy, but what the nation got instead was a reminder that even in times of prosperity, power can be misused when oversight is weak. The scandal reshaped public expectations of transparency, emboldened investigative journalism, and reinforced Congress's role as a check on the executive branch. And so, Teapot Dome endures not just as a chapter in history books, but as a warning whispered through every political generation. The public's trust is fragile, and once broken, it may never be restored. What about you? If you were in Harding's position, would you have spoken out against a friend's betrayal or kept silent to protect the image of your administration? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to see how another American president faced a scandal that redefined political accountability, watch our next videos.